Hello everyone, let's get started with Introduction to Architecture. This week we're actually going to be talking about space. So the big two things that we said sometimes are fighting in architecture is form and function. So we associated form a bit more to beauty. Yes, form has to do with all of them in a sense. Form has to do with all of them, but in most people associate it a bit more with beauty because form has to do with the shape of buildings, the way it looks, the actual massing of things. But space has to do a bit more with utilitas or the usability of things. So that's something that's very important. So according to Vitruvius, again, we're always going to come back to this truth: formitas, utilitas, and venustas. And so according to Vitruvius, space is a little bit more associated with usability or function. And why do you think that is the case? That's what we're going to be sort of understanding today, the idea of space, how it's associated with function, and how do we create a good space. So if we look into the building, if we start looking into the definitions of space, we're going to start understanding that space has to do with the volume of the structure, the parts of the building that we actually move through and we get to experience. But remember, we can only create space through form. So space is created through form. So they are communicating with each other. So in a way, mass and void. So which one do you think is form in regards to mass and void? Do you think mass is form or space? Do you think void is space or form? So hopefully you've answered that void is space. So massing is form, so the shape of it, and then you create a shape and the inside is actually void. So you see basically a shell with an interior that is empty. And so the interior, it becomes the void, and now it's space that can actually that can be inhabited. It's space that can be used. It's space that now becomes usable. And so what do we do? How can we use that space? How do we shape that space? And so there's going to be several variables, which we're going to be talking today, which is horizontal and vertical elements, closures and openings, and light and views. So those are some ways we can affect space. But remember, everything that we're doing has to do with the fact that we are affecting the space and we want to create the best space possible. So space is the void between forms. So why is space so important? The main idea why space is so important is because space is actually it's housing or it's creating these different functions. And function does provide a purpose to a building. So the main idea is that space basically is giving the function or the purpose of the building. This is where we get a word, and this is very important for you to learn this word, this architectural definition, which is program. You're going to be hearing this a lot when it comes to architecture. So the program is the various functions enclosed in the structure, and it's the responsibility of the architect to configure such spaces. So basically, I want you to think of, let's create a scenario. Let's imagine a library. If we are creating a library, and this is your library, what do you want to put in your library? What is some functions that you want it to have? So I want you to think of that for a couple of seconds. What do you want to include into your library? And this is a public library for the whole community. So what functions do you want it to have? And then you start thinking, okay, I might have a children's area. I might have a computer room. I will have most likely a restroom, perhaps some sort of coffee shop. I do want to have a lot of books. I want that to be the main idea. I want to have some quiet private study rooms. I want to have a teen section, and I want to have open seating. So now you're starting to divide this. You created your form, which was this outer shell. We don't know how it looks, but it encloses this, and now the inside, which is the void, is space that we can use. And so usually when you work with someone, they hire you as an architect, they tell you, they give you the program. We want 2,000 square feet of offices, we want 3,000 square feet of this. And so you start creating your program. It's a sort of a list that you have to create. And then you start dividing that, versus, which would require more space. You start dividing your program into maybe different variables, such as I want this area to be quiet, or this space needs more light. And this needs to be more enclosed. Imagine you're working in a place that, in the older times, there was photography labs that needed to be completely dark. But then you had a lobby that had to be more open. So then you start thinking of the program. The program is not truly is defined, but then the space becomes what's actually happening inside. The second word that you need to learn is design process. Design process is the iterative process. So I want you to look up this word. So what does the word iterative mean? What do you think it means, or what do you answer that it means? If you look up, hopefully you found something that says it has to do with repetition. So there's a lot of different definitions, but they all sort of mention this idea of repetition. Repetition. And the thing is that architecture is not just pretty straightforward. It's actually like this. You go forward, you go back, you have ideas, and you play around with your ideas. And so that's what it is. It's basically you keep throwing out ideas of, what is the best way to organize your space? What is the best way of playing around with your space? What is the best way of organizing your form even? And so it goes, this idea of the design process has to do with a lot of different variables that can be manipulated by the architect. So let's look at some of those variables. So one of those has to do with scale, has to do with the idea of size. So when you're dealing with space, right now we're not going to focus on design process for form. We've talked about that already, but now we're going to think about the design process of space. When you're thinking about space, one of the first things you're going to have to determine is how big of a space you have. Do you have a big space, or do you have a small space? If you have a very narrow lot for you to build, most likely you cannot build something very wide. So then if you need a lot of square footage, how do you resolve that? Most likely you'll go high, you'll go vertical, which is why we see a lot of skyscrapers. The land is not as limited, so instead of building wide, they build high. So you start to look into the size and the proportions, and that's going to determine what you can do or what you cannot do. The second thing is hierarchical and relationship. This is, you start understanding that you're not just building one space. Most likely, again, if you go to example of a library, most likely you're going to have kids section, and let's pretend you're going to have a quiet section, right? So most likely you don't want these two to be very close to each other, because there's a possibility the children might not be as quiet as you would want them to be. So then you start thinking, okay, I have space to fill, I have a large space, so you would look at your scale, but then you start realizing I might want to place the quiet area as far from the loud areas. So you can start, placing things differently around your library or your design. Hierarchical is that there's going to be different things that are more important or a bit more private or whatever, and so there's going to be things that might require more space. So maybe you need a lot more space for books because it's a library at the end of the day. So then you're going to have a smaller part for meetings rooms or things like this. So you start dividing the relationship between the rooms, between spaces, and you also start, determining which rooms are more important or need more attention. Perception, this is huge. I want you to remember this. When you're creating a space, at the end of the day, it's going to affect the person that's inhabiting the space. So so whatever color, materials you use is going to affect them. The proportion, the light that comes in, the temperature, even everything, it's going to affect it's going to encourage or discourage the person inside to want to stay there, to want to live there, to want to move there. So if again, going back to our example of the library, it is said that, light helps people feel happy and things like this. So if you're going back at a library and you do your study spaces, it'd be good to have a lot of natural light coming in, right? And perhaps in the kids section, you want maybe that too, but maybe you'll have a movie area here for the kids, and maybe you'll have a little bit less light there, So then you start thinking, how do you want the space to affect the person inside? So again, we talked about architecture is mass and void. Mass is form and void is the space. So space is the void between forms. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of void. Here we start seeing it. It's the idea of, if you call this poche. So if you want to sound smart and say this French word, it's called poche, which simply means pocket. So in the Roman time, in the older Roman times, they needed to provide space they needed to provide support for arches and domes, especially arches and domes. And as you can study this, you'll realize that the weight of this is really pushing down. And what it's trying to do is pushing this wall, it's trying to push it down so that it would fall this way. So if they build a very thin, wooden wall, it's not going to hold this huge wide span of a dome. So what do? They build huge walls. And so in this case, you start seeing that they had this huge walls. And that's where you see here, this huge walls all around this dome. But then they started to realize that they had this huge massing that they could actually start carving inside. And so this idea of carving into the void and into the massing and creating this sort of voids or openings, that's what the idea of poche is. So this idea of playing with void and mass. So I want you to keep thinking about that, because this idea of mass and void is crucial to the idea of space. So I want you to see this image really quickly, a couple of seconds. What was the first thing that you saw? Some will answer the candle holder, candle, or others would answer, this couple, or this, man and a woman in the bottom. And I don't know if there's like something psychologically if you see one or the other first, but it's just to show the idea of mass and void. So this darker shades is creating a silhouette of this couple. So the idea of mass and void is that the massing is creating the void that is being a result of the massing is creating a shape. So everything that you have in your room that has a mass, that has a shape, so think of your couch, think of your tables, it's taking a space and it's leaving a sort of negative void around your room. And look around your room right now and think, what is this space being created when, if you think of all your furniture as massing? One example that you can see it is in this image. This image, they created the space, the room, and then they created the furniture by these squares. Obviously, this chair is not just a square or rectangle, but they simplified it to a certain point. And now, hopefully this changes your perspective of space, because I don't think many of us look at our living room like this. But this would be a pretty fun example for you to do. Go to your living room and draw this. Draw your and you will see all the negative space being created, and that is a space that is waiting to be inhabited. And same thing, they did this sort of the opposite here, and we can see all the dark in this case is the spacing. Space and context. So space and context has to do with the idea that yes, you will create space, you're creating space, you're giving a place to build your space, but how is your space going to connect to the things around it? Remember, we're always building somewhere. You're building in a city, you're building in a forest, you're building somewhere, but you're not just building on its own. It's responding to where it's being to be building. So is your space, how is your space going to respond to this context? Is it going to reject it? Is it going to embrace it or communicate with it? So let's see some examples. In example number B, what do you think? Is it embracing, rejecting, or communicating with it? Hopefully you answered rejecting, because in B, it's creating this sort of private outdoor space, but it's being very walled in. It's basically saying nothing can come in from the outside, and if you do want to come in, you have to come through this door, and I'm gonna make sure I know who you are. So it's, you know, basically telling the space and the context they're not really communicating, and that's okay. That's very valid. You don't want your room to be communicating with with your garden, you know. And in option C, what do you think? Is it communicating? Is it rejecting, embracing, or communicating with it? Hopefully you answered embracing it, and also communicating is pliable. But in this case, it's communicating with it. It's embracing it, because as you can even feel, it's sort of allowing it for it to come. And most likely this looks like glass. So it's also sort of communicating, allowing for the people inside to see this outdoor area. And as you can tell here, they didn't create any walls or any fence. Maybe they'll add them later, but it kind of seems like whatever's happening outside can sort of communicate and connects to this spaces here. On E, it's communicating with it. It's sort of, you know, it's its own thing. It's not allowing the things to come in, you know, the context to come in, but it is communicating it. It's stating something. It's saying, I'm at the center, and it's sort of really standing its ground. So where you position yourself in your site is important. So if this would have been placed here, or here, or even here, it would have been completely different. But the fact that the space, the massing in the space is right at the center, is basically saying everything, everything comes to this. You know, everything is leading your eye into it, and sort of creating this sort of control of the area. Also, in other ways, you can, you know, go wide, or even just simply stand free within the site and just simply move around. So how are you really creating your space? How are you going to position yourself with the context? So let's continue with this. So the next part, I'm going to be talking about vertical and horizontal planes. And so this is elements that are going to be defining the actual space. Thank you for watching part 1. Please continue to the next video to watch vertical and horizontal planes.